In-laws cut our hair and left us bald, tied us out in the open so predators would eat us at night. Please save us. The widow, a mother of two, begged the lonely rancher. The wind carried a wet bite that evening, the kind of raw spring chill that smelled of thawed earth and swollen creeks. Andy Hall rode with his collar turned up and his hat tugged low, his sorrel mare pushing through mud that clung to her hooves like tar. He had been in town for salt, nails, and little else. His life had whittled down to such errands, bare and practical, after too many years of talking to ghosts instead of neighbors. The horizon carried no promise beyond another night of solitude by a stubborn fire. He was used to that. But then he heard it. A sound that didn't belong to prairie wind or restless cattle. A cry, thin, raw, breaking in and out as if carried on the teeth of the gusts. He reined in sharply, breath clouding, ears straining. At first he thought it a calf bawling, separated from the herd. Yet the longer he listened, the more human the sound became. He spurred the mare toward it, mud splashing his boots. The sky was sinking fast into that deep bruised purple before night, the last light leaking out behind ragged clouds. Again the cry came, sharper, threaded with a desperate edge that made his chest clench. He crested a low ridge and saw them. 3 figures lashed to a half-fallen fence near a dry gulch. His breath caught at the sight. A woman slumped forward, her arms bound behind her, her hair, no, not hair, but a scalp roughly shorn, her head scraped raw and patchy under the fading light. 2 children were tied beside her, both small, both bald as well, their thin faces streaked with dirt and terror. They were trembling, their lips moving soundlessly, eyes wide at the circling shapes slinking in the grass. Coyotes. 6, maybe 7 of them, tails twitching, yellow eyes catching the dusk. Andy's hand went to his revolver without thought. One shot cracked across the gulch, sharp and final. A coyote yelped and scattered, the others scattering with it, but not far. They would wait for darkness, patient as hunger itself. The children whimpered, and the woman's head lifted weakly at the sound of the gun. She blinked at Andy, confusion clouding her gaze, then sudden pleading. He swung down from his horse, boots sinking into damp earth, knife flashing as he cut at the coarse ropes. The cords had dug cruel grooves into their wrists and ankles. The boy, no more than 5, clutched his sister when the last rope fell. She might have been 8, her cheeks hollow, her lips blue from the cold. Andy scooped her up first, she was too weak to stand, and pressed her into his coat. Then he freed the woman. She staggered, nearly falling, and he caught her against his chest. She was light as driftwood, her breath ragged, her scalp mottled with bruises. "Please," she whispered, her voice rasped thin. "Please, save us." The words were not needed. He already had them, pressed into his bones by the sight of her and the 2 children swaying on their feet. He hoisted the boy into the saddle, then lifted the girl to sit before him. The woman he half carried, half dragged until he could swing her up behind the children. She clung to them weakly, and Andy mounted, crowding them all onto the mare's back. The coyotes had crept closer again, bold under the darkening sky. One bared its teeth, snarling low. Andy cocked his revolver and fired into the dirt near its paws. The pack scattered once more, but he knew the reprieve would not last. He urged the mare forward, slow at first over the uneven gulch, then faster as the land opened. The rain began in scattered drops, cold against his neck, quickly thickening into a slanting downpour that blurred the world into streaks of gray. The mare snorted, her ears pinned back, but Andy pressed her onward, his arms wrapped around the frail bodies before him. The girl shivered violently. Andy pulled his coat tighter, bending low over her, his chin brushing the crown of her bare scalp. He could feel every tremor, every shallow breath, as though his own ribs carried their suffering. The woman behind him sagged against his back, and he thought she had gone still until he felt her fingers clutch the edge of his shirt. Weak, yes, but still fighting. The miles dragged. The rain turned the prairie to muck, water filling every hoofprint. Andy's jaw tightened, eyes scanning the horizon for the dark outline of his cabin. Each clap of thunder made the children jolt, the boy whimpering softly, the girl burying her face against Andy's chest. He whispered nothing. He had no words that would soothe, but he kept his arms firm, as though to promise with muscle and bone that no storm nor beast would take them tonight. At last the faint shape of his cabin loomed, hunched against the slope of a rise. Relief was a dull ache, not joy. He pushed the mare hard, pulling up beneath the porch overhang. He slid from the saddle, catching the children as they slumped, then lifted the woman down with arms that shook from more than exertion. Inside, the cabin was dark and smelled of smoke from an old fire gone cold. He laid them near the hearth, then set about with swift movements. Kindling piled, flint struck, sparks coaxed until flame licked up the logs. The room warmed slowly, shadows retreating from the corners. He fetched blankets, wrapping each small form tightly, then draped one around the woman. Her lips moved faintly, as if to speak, but her strength failed before sound came. The girl opened her eyes, wide and glassy, staring at him through lashes heavy with rain. She tried to mouth something, thank you perhaps, but only a sob slipped out. Andy touched her shoulder, awkward in his gentleness, then pulled back, as if fearing his hand might scorch her. The boy had curled against his sister, eyes closing as the heat seeped into him. The woman's breath steadied little by little, though her face remained ghostly pale, her scalp stark under the firelight. Andy sat back on his heels, revolver resting on the floor beside him, watching over them as the storm rattled the cabin walls. He did not ask who they were. He did not ask why. Those questions could wait for daylight. All that mattered was that 3 lives had been pulled from the teeth of night, and for now they were his to guard. He rose once more, fetched a pot of water, set it to warm. The cabin filled with the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. Outside, the coyotes cried again, a chorus thin and hungry, circling beyond the ring of light. Andy's hand went to his revolver out of instinct, though he knew they would not breach the walls. The fire threw long shadows, and in them, Andy sat with his hat low, his face a sculpture of hard lines and silence. The children shifted in their blankets, sighs breaking through their exhaustion. The woman stirred faintly, head rolling toward the heat. He watched her, expression unreadable, until her lips moved again. "Thank you," she breathed, so faint he nearly thought it the wind. Then she fell into darkness, leaving Andy alone with the hiss of rain on the roof and the thin cries of predators beyond the walls. He leaned back, eyes fixed on the flames, knowing he had stepped into a storm that no weather could match. And somewhere out there, men who had done this, men cruel enough to shear a woman's hair, to bind children as bait, rode free under the same sky. Andy gripped the revolver tighter. The fire popped, the children shifted, and the storm raged. For the first time in years, his cabin was no longer empty. And for the first time in years, he felt the weight of a battle pressing in before it had even begun. Morning came slow, bleeding pale light through the cracks in the cabin shutters. The storm had broken some time before dawn, leaving behind the heavy smell of wet earth and smoke that clung to the air. Andy Hall stirred from his chair near the hearth, stiff from a night spent watching the fire and the 3 strangers bundled in his blankets. The children had shifted close to their mother in the night, their small forms tangled against her side, the rise and fall of their breaths proof that life still clung where it might have been stolen. He rose without a word, his boots quiet on the plank floor, and stoked the embers until flames licked higher. The boy stirred, mumbling in his sleep, then settled again. Andy set water to boil, the sound a soft hiss that filled the hush of the room. From a cupboard, he pulled a small sack of cornmeal and another of beans, setting about breakfast with the precision of habit. There was comfort in measured movements, in the scrape of spoon against tin, in the way the steam rose when he poured hot water over grounds and let the cabin fill with the bitter scent of coffee. The girl was first to wake. Her eyes opened wide and wary, scanning the room as if she'd forgotten where she was. Then she saw the fire, her mother, her brother, and at last Andy standing over the stove. Her lips pressed tight, but she didn't shrink back when his gaze met hers. She only clutched the blanket tighter around her shoulders, the bald crown of her head stark in the dim light. He saw the shame flicker across her face and turned back to his task, as though he had not noticed. The woman woke soon after, groaning softly as she tried to sit. Andy moved toward her but stopped short, letting her find her balance alone. She pushed herself up, the blanket slipping to her lap, her eyes downcast. Her scalp bore the cruel marks of shears and rough hands, pale lines crossing tender flesh. She pulled the blanket up again, covering herself as though modesty could hide the damage. Andy said nothing, only set a tin plate of cornbread and beans on the table, then poured a second tin cup of coffee and placed it beside hers. She stared at the food for a long while before her trembling hands reached for it. The children, roused by the smell, came to the table without being asked. Andy set portions before them, smaller, careful not to overwhelm. They ate in silence, the children quick and hungry, the woman slower, as though each bite carried weight. Andy drank his coffee standing by the window, eyes on the greening slope outside where mist curled above the damp grass. When the girl finished, she rose and carried her plate toward him, offering it with a shy glance. He took it, rinsed it with the last of the hot water, and set it aside. The boy followed, mimicking his sister. Their mother remained at the table, hands folded, eyes lowered. The day unfolded in quiet tasks. Andy stepped outside to split kindling, the thud of axe echoing across the damp morning. The children watched from the porch, small hands clutching the railing. He caught their eyes once, gave a curt nod, then showed them by example, splitting wood into manageable pieces, stacking it by the wall. After a moment's hesitation, the girl stepped down, picked up a small log, and carried it clumsily to the pile. The boy followed, his steps uncertain but eager. Andy worked steady, neither encouraging nor discouraging, letting them find their rhythm. Inside, the woman tidied the cabin. She folded Andy's shirts left drying near the hearth, mended a torn sleeve with needle and thread she must have found in his small box of supplies. Her hands were slow, trembling, but determined. When Andy returned, arms loaded with fresh wood, he paused at the sight. She did not look up, did not speak, only continued her task as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The air warmed as the sun climbed, and the smell of wet sage drifted through the open door. Andy worked at the fence line, hammering nails where the rails had sagged, while the children gathered wildflowers and pressed them into tin cups of water. The girl set one cup on the table inside, shyly placing it near her mother. The woman's lips quivered, and she brushed the petals with her fingers, eyes glistening though no tears fell. By evening, the cabin had taken on a different shape. It was still his, still sparse and practical, but the presence of others had softened its edges. A scarf he had left folded in a drawer now wrapped the woman's head. He had not offered it aloud. He had simply placed it on the table that morning. She had taken it without thanks, but when she caught him looking at her that night, a silent gratitude flickered between them. The children curled near the hearth again, the girl with her head against the old hound's side. Andy watched the boy tug at the dog's ear, the animal patient under the touch. Their mother sat nearby, hands folded in her lap, gaze lost in the fire. Andy sat across from her, silent as always, his coffee cooling between his palms. When the boy's shoes split at the seam, Andy fetched a needle and leather scrap, working by lamplight. The boy watched with wide eyes, the girl leaning close to see. Andy didn't speak, only finished the repair and handed the shoe back. The boy slipped it on, grinning for the first time, though small and fleeting. His sister's eyes lingered on Andy, curious, measuring. The cabin settled into quiet. The fire popped, the dog shifted, and rain began again outside, gentle this time. The woman rose to her feet, moving toward the shelf where a comb rested. She picked it up and sat with her daughter, trying to braid what hair remained. But her hands faltered, the short shorn strands slipping loose. Her face crumpled, lips trembling as she tried again. Andy watched from his chair, his jaw working as though against words. At last he set down his cup, moved to kneel beside them. He reached for the comb, his hands steady, and with surprising patience began to weave what little hair could be gathered into a braid. It was clumsy but sure, a braid of defiance rather than beauty. The girl smiled faintly, and the woman covered her mouth with her hand, shoulders shaking. When the braid was done, Andy handed back the comb without a word. The woman met his gaze for the first time, eyes raw with sorrow and gratitude. Something unspoken passed between them, a tether formed not by speech but by the weight of shared silence. The children were soon asleep, their breaths soft in the hush of the room. Andy returned to his chair, staring at the fire. The woman remained where she was, watching him. At last, her voice broke the stillness. "You didn't ask who I was. Or why." Her words were low, rough, as though dragged out against her will. Andy lifted his eyes, steady and unreadable. "Didn't need to," he said. She swallowed hard, pulling the scarf tighter around her head. Outside, the rain thickened, pattering against the roof. Her hands trembled in her lap, but her voice came again, softer this time. They'll come. They won't leave it be. Andy's eyes lingered on her, then shifted to the shadows beyond the firelight. His hand rested on the revolver beside his chair, fingers brushing the worn grip. The cabin held its breath, the storm pressing close against the walls, and the woman's warning hung heavy in the air, a promise of danger not yet seen but already felt. The thaw of early spring deepened over the next days, bringing with it a smell of damp soil and the soft trickle of melted snow running down gullies. Andy worked outside more often, his hammer ringing against nails, his shoulders bent to the fences that had sagged through winter. He kept his eyes on his tasks, but his ears caught every sound from the cabin, the murmur of the woman's voice guiding her children, the scrape of their small feet on the floor, the occasional pause where silence grew heavy, as if memory had stolen her breath. Her name came out one evening by the fire, spoken without ceremony, almost as though it had escaped her lips by accident. "Sarah," she said softly, after the children had fallen asleep near the hearth. Andy gave a short nod, not asking for more. Yet as the flames flickered and the night pressed close, she began to speak again, each word slow and halting, shaped by a reluctance that fought against the need to be heard. She told him she had been born a Caldwell, raised on a small patch of land along the Brazos where cotton barely covered the debts. Her father had married her to Thomas Benton, the son of a wealthy rancher, when she was still little more than a girl. "It was meant to be a blessing," she murmured, her eyes on the fire. "My family thought I'd be saved from the hunger that followed our winters." For a time, Thomas had been kind enough, but his death in a riding accident 2 years past had left her tethered to his kin, men and women who carried cruelty as though it were their birthright. She swallowed, fingers worrying the frayed edge of the blanket around her shoulders. They had never forgiven her for bearing children rather than heirs, never forgiven her for outliving him. Land and cattle meant everything to the Bentons, and her presence was a knot they longed to cut loose. When the law would not take her children away, the family carved out its own judgment. "They shaved us," she whispered, her voice nearly breaking. "Cut us down like animals. Tied us out where the coyotes circle. Said if the wilderness wanted us gone, it was God's will." The words left her trembling, but Andy did not move closer, did not intrude with touch. He let her speak into the silence, the fire crackling between them. When she fell quiet, he only nodded once, as though her story had simply confirmed something he already knew. The world could be merciless, and the measure of a man or woman lay in how they faced it. The children learned quickly to cling to the routines of Andy's cabin. Helena gathered eggs from the hens, her small bald head hidden under one of his old bandanas. Samuel followed Andy like a shadow, watching him shoe the mare, watching him mend the corral gate. The boy rarely spoke, but his small hand often brushed Andy's sleeve, as though testing if the solid bulk of the man would stay. Andy never pulled away. Yet shadows lengthened. Rumors drifted from town on the lips of passing riders. One afternoon, Jonas Fletcher, a wiry neighbor with a beard white as bone, rode by with a coil of wire slung over his saddle. He paused at the gate, squinting at Andy with the blunt curiosity of men who have little else but gossip to fill their hours. "Benton boys been sniffin' around," Jonas said, spitting into the dust. "Sayin' their brother's widow ran off mad. Folk wonderin' if you seen her." His eyes shifted past Andy toward the cabin, where the faint sound of children's laughter had escaped through the window. Andy's face hardened, but his voice stayed calm. "Ain't seen much of anything but mud and fences." Jonas studied him, then gave a slow nod. "Best keep it that way, son. Them Bentons don't let go once they get their teeth in." He rode on, leaving the warning hanging in the air like a drawn noose. That night, Sarah's hands trembled as she set out supper. The children chattered about the hen that had pecked Samuel's boot, but her eyes kept straying to the window, to the darkness pressing in. "They'll come," she whispered when the children had gone to bed. "You don't know them like I do. They'll not leave shame unanswered." Andy sat sharpening his knife by the fire, the scrape of steel on stone steady and slow. His gaze lifted to her only once. "Then we'll be ready," he said simply. His calm struck her more deeply than threats would have. She drew the scarf tighter around her head, tears glinting though she tried to hide them. The days that followed were taut with waiting. Andy's every action grew sharper, checking his rifle by lamplight, stacking extra wood by the door, scanning the horizon when he rode out with the cattle. The children felt it, though they could not name it. Helena grew quieter, hovering near her mother. Samuel clutched at Andy's coat whenever he stepped outside, his small voice breaking in fear, "Don't go far." One evening, Sarah found Andy on the porch, oiling the stock of his rifle. The sky burned with streaks of red and gold, the air alive with the smell of wet grass. She stood in the doorway for a long while before speaking. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "You don't owe us." Andy kept his eyes on the rifle, rubbing the cloth in slow circles. "Don't figure it's about owing," he said. "Figure it's about what a man can stand to see, and what he can't." She stepped onto the porch, her bare feet brushing the damp boards. "They'll kill you for it." He finally looked at her then, his face carved in shadows by the falling light. "Then they'll learn I ain't easy to kill." Something in her broke at that, not in despair, but in the weight of realizing she was no longer alone. She lowered her head, tears slipping silent down her cheeks, and for the first time she did not turn away when Andy's presence filled the space beside her. He did not touch her, but the steadiness of his silence anchored her against the storm she knew was coming. The children felt the change too. That night, Helena asked her mother if they would have to run again. Sarah smoothed her daughter's head, her palm covering the ragged stubble where hair should have been, and shook her head. "Not this time," she murmured, though her voice trembled. Spring deepened, buds pushing green through the soil, birds returning to the fields. Yet unease thickened with every dawn. Hoofprints were found in the soft ground near the creek, not belonging to Andy's mare. A lantern glow was glimpsed on a far hill one night, too brief to mark as chance. The dog growled at nothing more than the wind, hackles raised, eyes trained on the dark beyond the fence. Sarah tried to hide her fear from the children, but Andy saw it in her shaking hands when she kneaded bread, in the way her eyes darted toward every creak of wood or snap of twig outside. He did not speak comfort. Words were not his trade, but he stood near whenever he could, his shadow falling long beside hers. It was Helena who gave voice to the terror lingering at the edges. One afternoon, while Andy mended tack at the table, she crept close, her small hands twisting in her lap. "It was the men with the red cloths," she whispered, her eyes wide. "The ones who cut us. They wore red cloths at their throats." Her voice shook, and she glanced toward the window, as if expecting those same men to ride up at that moment. Andy set aside his work and met her eyes with steady calm. "I remember," he said, his voice firm enough to settle her trembling. The memory lived sharp in Sarah too. At night she woke gasping, the image of those red kerchiefs flashing in her dreams, the sound of her children's cries mingled with the howl of circling coyotes. Once Andy found her by the fire, shoulders hunched, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. He did not speak but crouched near, placing a tin cup of water beside her hand. When she finally lifted her eyes, his were steady, grounding her in the present. The bond between them grew in the spaces left by silence. She folded his shirts when they dried by the fire, though he never asked. He left extra biscuits at her place on the table, though he never mentioned it. When Samuel clambered into Andy's lap one morning, holding out a toy carved from scrap wood, Andy accepted it with the faintest tug at his mouth that might have been a smile. But the storm pressed closer. The neighbors carried whispers, each one sharper than the last. The Bentons were gathering men, some said. They had been seen at the saloon, drunk and loud about their vengeance. Others claimed the law had turned its head, unwilling to challenge the family's reach. Each word tightened the coil of dread around Sarah's chest, and even Andy's calm presence could not fully quiet it. One night, as rain pattered soft on the roof, the dog rose stiffly from the hearth, hackles lifting. A horn call echoed faint and low from the hills, carrying through the wet air like the cry of some hunting beast. Sarah froze, the tin cup slipping from her fingers. The children clung to her skirts, eyes wide. Andy stood slowly, rifle in hand, his jaw set hard. "They've found us," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling, her eyes wide with the terror she had fought so long to keep hidden. Dawn came thin and gray, the kind of light that carries no warmth, only the truth of what waits. Andy stood on the porch with his rifle across his arm, listening to the land breathe. The fields glistened wet with dew, and the earth smelled raw and unsettled. Behind him, the cabin was stirring, Sarah moving softly so the children would not wake, her hands folding blankets with the kind of care one gives to rituals before a trial. The horn call from the night still echoed in her chest. She hadn't slept, her mind full of red kerchiefs and laughter sharp as a blade. The first riders appeared as the sun pushed itself weakly over the ridge. 4 of them, then 5, their horses cutting dark shapes against the sky. They rode slow, deliberate, the kind of slowness that showed they weren't afraid. The Benton brothers, their kerchiefs bright red at their throats, and a couple of hired men behind them. Andy's grip on the rifle tightened, but his face didn't change. He stepped off the porch into the damp grass, placing himself between the cabin and the oncoming riders. Sarah came to the doorway, the scarf wrapped tight around her head, her children clinging to her skirts. She wanted to pull them back, hide them in the dark corner near the hearth, but her legs would not move. She watched Andy walk forward, his broad shoulders steady, and something inside her stilled even as terror twisted her gut. The Bentons reined in a short distance from the fence. The eldest, Wade, leaned in the saddle with a smirk tugging his lips. His beard was black, streaked with gray, his eyes flat with contempt. "Hall," he called, his voice carrying on the damp air. "You've got something belongs to us." Andy didn't move. "Don't see your mark on him." The men behind Wade chuckled, low and mean. Wade spat into the grass. "That woman's kin. Our kin. And them brats are Benton blood, whether we like it or not. You got no business harborin' what ran from its rightful place." Sarah flinched at the word "it's," shame and fury crashing together in her chest. Andy's face didn't flicker. He shifted the rifle, the barrel glinting faint in the weak light. "They're here now. That's all that matters." The younger Benton, Clay, snarled. "You think you can stand against us, Hall? 1 man against 5? We'll burn that cabin down and take what we please. You best hand 'em over before we decide your bones ain't worth buryin'." The hired men laughed, but the sound faltered when thunder growled on the horizon. The spring storm had been building all night, and now dark clouds gathered heavy over the ridge. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain and the sharp promise of lightning. The land itself seemed to bristle. Andy stepped forward another pace, his boots sinking into the wet grass. "You'll not take them." His voice was quiet, but it carried with the weight of something immovable. The standoff stretched, air thick, the horses stamping nervously as the storm crept closer. Then Wade's smirk hardened, and he raised his hand. "Take him." The riders spurred forward. Andy raised the rifle and fired. The shot cracked like thunder, sending one man's horse rearing. Clay fired back, the bullet whining past Andy's ear. The world erupted in chaos, gunfire snapping, horses screaming, Sarah pulling her children back into the cabin as bullets struck the porch rail. Andy moved with grim precision, reloading, firing, shifting behind the fence posts. The storm broke open overhead, rain slashing down in sheets, mud rising quick beneath their boots. The Bentons pressed hard, circling, trying to cut him off from the cabin. Andy dropped one of the hired men with a clean shot, the man tumbling into the mud. His kerchief soaked red not with pride but with blood. Inside, Sarah's hands shook as she pulled a second rifle from the wall, fumbling with the powder. Helena clutched her arm, eyes wide. "Mama!" "Hush!" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking but fierce. "Stay low. Stay with your brother." She rose to the window, loading as she had seen Thomas do long ago, her breath catching as the wood rattled from another shot outside. She lifted the rifle, sighted through the rain, and fired. The bullet struck close enough to drive one rider back, his curses lost in the storm. Andy glanced back once, saw her there, and something fierce sparked in his chest. She wasn't broken, no matter what had been done to her. She stood with him. The fight dragged into the yard, mud sucking at their boots. Lightning split the sky, blinding for a heartbeat, thunder rolling so loud it drowned the gunfire. The dog burst from the cabin door, teeth bared, lunging at a rider's leg. The man screamed, firing wildly as he toppled into the muck. Andy charged then, rifle swinging, striking another across the jaw. But Wade came hard, his pistol aimed straight at Andy's chest. Time seemed to slow, the rain, the mud, the children's cries muffled in Sarah's ears. She saw the flash of the pistol lifting, saw Andy turn too slow, and something inside her snapped. She raised the rifle again, her hands trembling, and pulled the trigger. The shot roared louder than the storm. Wade jerked back in the saddle, eyes wide in disbelief, blood blooming across his chest. His horse screamed and bolted, carrying him limp into the sheets of rain. The field went still for a breath. Clay shouted in rage, spurring forward, but the sight of his brother falling had broken the fire in the others. One rider fled outright, the dog snapping at his heels. Clay pulled back at the last moment, curses spilling from his mouth as he turned his horse and galloped into the storm. And then it was over. The rain poured down, washing blood into the mud, drumming on the cabin roof. Andy stood chest heaving, rifle lowered, his shirt soaked through, his hair plastered to his brow. Sarah was still at the window, the rifle slipping from her hands, her breath ragged. The children ran to her, clinging to her legs, sobbing. She dropped to her knees, pulling them into her arms, her tears mingling with the rain that had blown through the shattered glass. Andy stepped into the cabin, his boots leaving prints of mud, his eyes sweeping the room. He looked at her then, truly looked, not as a burden he had taken on, but as someone who had stood beside him when it mattered most. "You saved me," he said simply. Sarah shook her head, clutching the children tighter. "We saved each other." The storm began to ease, the rain softening to a steady drizzle. Neighbors arrived in the distance, drawn by the sound of gunfire, their horses cutting through the mist. Jonas Fletcher dismounted, staring at the scene, the fallen men, the shattered fence, Andy standing steady in the wreckage with the widow and her children. He doffed his hat, something like respect in his eyes. Word would spread fast now, faster than the storm clouds moving east. Sarah rose slowly, her scarf slipping, her bald head gleaming wet in the firelight. She flinched as if to hide, but Andy reached out, steadying her shoulder. His hand was firm, not possessive but unyielding, as though to say she had nothing left to hide. She met his eyes, her lips trembling, and for the first time she did not look away. The children pressed close, one on each side of her, their faces pale but their eyes alive. Outside, the storm broke fully, a shaft of sunlight cutting through the clouds, striking the wet grass until it glowed. Andy stood with them in the doorway, the world washed clean and raw before them. In the silence that followed, Sarah's voice was a whisper. "It isn't over. They'll come again." Andy's hand tightened on the rifle. His eyes scanned the horizon, steady as stone. "Then we'll be waiting." And as the last drops of rain fell, the dog growled low at the distant hills, where shadows still moved unseen.